There is a bridge standing over the Detroit River tonight that should already be alive with movement. Thousands of trucks should be rolling across it. Factories should be depending on it. Commuters should be using it every morning. Customs agents should already be processing traffic beneath its lights. Instead, it sits almost perfectly still, silent, finished but unused. And the longer you look at that image, the stranger it becomes. Because this is not an abandoned project. It is not unfinished. It did not run out of money. It did not collapse under engineering failure. This bridge is complete. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, one of the largest infrastructure projects ever built between Canada and the United States, is fully operational. Every cable has been installed. Every inspection lane is ready. The toll systems work. The pavement is finished. The lights turn on every night. Billions of dollars were spent building it, and yet no one can drive across it. Not because engineers failed, because politics intervened. That single fact transforms the entire story from infrastructure news into something far more important. Because bridges are supposed to represent certainty. Historically, major infrastructure projects between allied countries symbolized confidence in the future. Governments build bridges when they believe relationships will remain stable for generations. Bridges physically embody trust. They are long-term promises made out of steel and concrete. That is what makes this situation feel so unsettling. The Gordie Howe Bridge was supposed to symbolize the strength of the Canada-US relationship. Instead, it is exposing fractures inside it. And the deeper you go into the story, the more dramatic the implications become. The Detroit-Windsor corridor is not some minor regional crossing. It is one of the most economically critical trade arteries in North America. Huge portions of the automotive industry depend on it. Manufacturing systems in Ontario and the American Midwest are deeply interconnected. Vehicle parts cross the border constantly, sometimes multiple times before a single car is fully assembled. Entire supply chains depend on smooth movement across that river. So the logic behind the new bridge originally seemed obvious and practical. The old Ambassador Bridge had handled enormous traffic volumes for decades, but governments worried about overdependence on a single aging crossing, especially one controlled privately. A second bridge meant redundancy, capacity, stability, economic security. At least, that was the idea. And politically, the project was presented almost like a symbol of permanent cooperation between two countries that supposedly shared the most stable economic partnership in the world. But now look at what happened. The bridge intended to reduce economic friction has itself become economic friction. And that irony is so sharp that it almost feels symbolic on purpose. A structure designed to connect two nations is now exposing the growing tension between them. That reversal is what gives this story emotional gravity far beyond transportation policy. Because once a completed bridge becomes bargaining leverage, people begin asking larger questions. If this can happen to a bridge, what else can become leverage? Supply chains? Energy exports? Defense cooperation? Electricity grids? Critical minerals? Manufacturing networks? And suddenly, the story stops feeling local. Now it feels geopolitical. Now it feels like a warning. What makes the situation especially explosive psychologically is the issue of ownership and financing. Canada paid for the bridge. That detail changes everything emotionally. If both countries had equally financed the project, people would naturally assume both governments had equal authority over the opening timeline. But that is not what happened here. Canada financed the entire project. Over $6.4 billion. The roads, the bridge, the customs plazas, the infrastructure. Everything. And yet now the opening appears tied to broader negotiations and political disputes happening in Washington. To many Canadians, that creates an almost humiliating image. You pay for the bridge, you build the bridge, you finish the bridge, and then someone else tells you when it can open. That feeling is why this story has become emotionally powerful in Canada, in a way many outsiders may not immediately understand. Because underneath the infrastructure debate sits a deeper national anxiety. How dependent should Canada really be on the United States? For generations, the relationship between the two countries operated on an unspoken assumption. America was larger, more powerful economically, and Canada ultimately needed stable access to the American market above almost everything else. That reality shaped the psychology of negotiations for decades. Canada was often careful, diplomatic, quiet, measured. Even during disagreements, there was usually an assumption that Ottawa would eventually compromise because maintaining economic stability mattered too much. But now, something about the tone feels different. Not dramatically aggressive, not openly hostile, just different. More willing to resist, more willing to wait. And psychologically, patience changes power dynamics completely. The Windsor mayor's comments became so important precisely because they represented this shift. When he said Canada should keep the bridge closed rather than accept a bad deal, he was rejecting the old assumption of urgency. He was essentially saying, "We are not desperate." That sentence alone changes negotiations, because leverage often belongs not to the strongest side, but to the side willing to endure discomfort longer. Historically, smaller countries negotiating with the United States were assumed to be under greater pressure to settle quickly. But now Canada appears unexpectedly calm. And that calmness itself becomes strategic. America sounds loud. Canada sounds patient. America makes public threats. Canada quietly lets the finished bridge sit there untouched. And visually, that contrast becomes incredibly powerful. The bridge itself turns into a physical symbol of political restraint. A massive illuminated structure standing motionless over the river while negotiations continue behind closed doors. Almost like a giant monument to unresolved tension. And then there's the private business dimension, the part of the story that makes audiences truly lean forward. Because once private financial interests enter the picture, everything suddenly feels more complicated. The Ambassador Bridge has dominated Detroit-Windsor traffic for decades. Every truck crossing represented revenue. A new, publicly backed bridge threatens that position directly. So when reports surfaced about lobbying activity connected to people tied to the existing bridge, around the same time political pressure against the Gordie Howe Bridge intensified, the story immediately became more than policy. Now it looked like competing power centers colliding. Government interests, private wealth, trade politics, national leverage, all converging around a single bridge. Whether every accusation is fully provable almost becomes secondary politically, because the optics alone are extraordinary. To the public, the sequence appears dramatic. A competing bridge threatens existing financial interests. Political pressure suddenly escalates. A completed international crossing remains closed. That creates a narrative people instantly understand. Power protecting itself. And historically, audiences are always captivated by stories where invisible systems of power suddenly become visible. That is why this bridge fascinates people. Because it transforms abstract geopolitical tensions into something concrete that people can literally see. And visually, the symbolism is almost cinematic. At night, the Gordie Howe Bridge glows across the Detroit River, enormous, modern, futuristic. It looks like a monument to cooperation. But underneath that image sits paralysis. No movement, no traffic, no opening date, just silence. And silence can sometimes feel more dramatic than open conflict, especially between allies. Because the most unsettling part of this entire story is not that America and Canada disagree. Countries always disagree. The unsettling part is that a relationship once viewed as automatic now suddenly looks conditional, transactional, strategic. That reflects a much larger global shift happening right now. For decades after the Cold War, Western economies became deeply integrated under the assumption that political stability was permanent. countries built entire industrial systems around interdependence. Now, governments increasingly see dependency itself as vulnerability. Trade is no longer just economics. Infrastructure is no longer neutral. Supply chains are no longer invisible. Everything is strategic now. And the Gordie Howe Bridge may be one of the clearest visual symbols of that transformation anywhere in the world. Because in one image, it captures the contradiction of the modern era. Nations are economically connected more deeply than ever before, while politically trusting each other less. That is why this story resonates so strongly with people once they understand it. On the surface, it is about a bridge. Underneath, it is about power, about leverage, about dependency, about national confidence, about whether allies still behave like allies when billions of dollars and political influence are involved. And perhaps most importantly, it is about a psychological shift that may already be underway inside Canada itself. For generations, many Canadians assumed the relationship with the United States was the fixed center of the country's economic reality. But this bridge, strangely enough, is forcing people to reconsider that assumption. Because when a fully completed bridge can sit unused due to political pressure, people start asking uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, leverage, and vulnerability. And that is why the image of this empty bridge feels so haunting. Not because it is physically broken, but because it reveals something political breaking underneath it. The bridge will eventually open. Almost everyone knows that. But by the time it does, the real damage may already have been done, because the meaning of the bridge has changed. It no longer simply represents connection. Now, it represents negotiation. And once a bridge becomes a bargaining chip, people begin to wonder whether the relationship it was built to support is as stable as they once believed.